Welcome to the Pharma Podcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in Canadian pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. Welcome to Season 2. It seems surreal that we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm still working from home. I've adjusted, but I can't wait to get back to normal. I miss my colleagues. I miss the energy and creativity that only comes from person-to-person collaboration. We all hope that a vaccine will get us there sooner. Several COVID-19 vaccine candidates are in development and launch plans are being drafted. Progress is unfolding at an unprecedented pace. More than 200 potential vaccines are in development and more than 40 have entered human clinical trials. At least one application has been submitted to Health Canada under the interim order. Canada currently has access to a guaranteed 174 million doses of potential COVID-19 vaccine. This represents over $1 billion in advance purchase agreements. In addition, Canada has pledged to the World Health Organization's Advanced Market Commitment, the AMC, $220 million to purchase 15 million vaccine doses from the COVAX facility, plus $220 million to purchase doses for low and middle income countries. Securing regulatory approval and supply agreements is a great first step, but how will the vaccine be rolled out safely and equitably? To help us understand how industry in Canada is preparing for the rollout, I've invited Dan Chiasson, President and CEO of the Canadian Association for Pharmacy Distribution and Management. Welcome again to the Pharma Podcast, Dan.
Well, thank you for having me return, Sam.
Last season, we had you on the Pharma Podcast. We discussed Canada's drug supply during the pandemic. We touched on PPEs. We're now moving forward. We're at the tail end, hopefully, and we're now talking therapeutics and potential treatments of vaccine. Granted, at this time, there are many unknowns. What are some of the challenges you foresee?
Yeah, so you're right, Sam. You know, from a supply chain perspective, COVID-19 has thrown us a number of curveballs. So early on in the pandemic, PPE was front and center in conversations at multiple levels. We then proceeded into ensuring that the drug supply chain had some stability, and there were some actions taken in order to neutralize the pent-up demand and to ensure that supply was in fact flowing internationally. And now we're likely dealing with the most complex of the supply chain challenges related to COVID-19, which is COVID-19 vaccine distribution. And I can think of four things that make this complex, difficult. First is the volume that is anticipated. To give you scale on this one, many of the COVID-19 vaccines will require double dosing. So given Canada's population, we're probably looking at 75 million doses having to be administered in a relatively short period of time. That compares to 10 to 15 million doses of the influenza or flu vaccine that gets administered every fall, winter season. So it's multiples of the flu vaccine efforts, and again, it's a time crunch as well, because we would do the COVID-19 vaccine distribution at scale, presumably over weeks and months, but not years. So that's challenge number one, is volume. Challenge number two, which is quite a bit different than other vaccines, is the temperature and stability of the vaccine. While we don't know all the details of the handling requirements for these vaccines, Sam, what we know is some of the early candidates require either frozen or ultra-frozen handling capabilities. And it's the frozen and ultra-frozen that will require a lot of planning, a lot of building out capacity that is likely not already present in our existing supply chain. And so that's for me, complexity number 2. Number 3 is that we're really thinking of multiple vaccines coming onto the market at different times, requiring multiple doses and without interchangeability. So how will the supply chain actors, whether it's distributors, whether it's administrators, those that will be administering the vaccines, whether it's doctors, public health staff, hospitals or pharmacies, how will they be managing the multiple SKUs with multiple doses that become available at different times? And the last one is, and we don't know this yet, but I anticipate that the dollar value of the vaccines will make this a critical piece of spend by the government. And so we need to be very sensitive to the risk of waste so that we are not wasting precious resources, either budgetary or human resources in the distribution of the vaccine. So those would be where my thinking is at early on in terms of understanding what we're going to be dealing with in the next few months.
When do you expect the vaccine to roll out, and how long do you think it will take?
So there's no clear answer on that one, and I think if somebody had the answer to that, they would be on talk shows and on government agendas already. But no, the best information I have at this point is that vaccines may become available early in 2021. Could be as early as Q1 or maybe Q2. But even at that point, my suspicion is that it will not be widely available. There will be some vaccines that become available that trickle in through the global supply chain, and Canada will have its share of the early inventory. But I don't think we're going to actually see the 75 million required doses available early on. So I would expect that it's going to trickle in initially before it becomes available at scale.
Yeah. I don't imagine it'll be available at scale, as you mentioned. So who should get the vaccine first?
Well, I think that's a question for the public health agencies. What we've heard thus far is certainly the most vulnerable population should be prioritized, as would essential workers in the healthcare field to make sure that we can look after people with the appropriate treatment. So I think to me that makes sense that population would be first in line. But again, those are decisions that haven't been shared with us, and that will be made, I'm sure, at the right level of public health throughout Canada.
And what role should government play, and what role should industry play in the rollout?
Well, I think that's going to be a highly, highly collaborative effort. Governments are taking the lead around the world, and the Canadian government, as you mentioned at the outset, has already made their pre-purchase commitments to make sure that they're not left out of the vaccine supply when it becomes available. So governments, well, first and foremost, the federal government and the Public Health Agency of Canada, they've already appointed a COVID-19 vaccine task force with a mandate to secure supply when it becomes available, and also think through the deployment imperatives that will be in front of us when the vaccines do become available. But as I mentioned previously, the complexity of this vaccine will require some pre-planning, and so in terms of the roles of public institutions, I think they need to be collaborating with various supply chain stakeholders, including the private sector, to try to be planful in terms of the infrastructure that's going to be required to move vaccines that are otherwise in cold chain. And as you pointed out, some are refrigerated, but in many cases, some of the early contenders are frozen or ultra frozen candidates.
Mm-hmm. Special provisions for rural, Indigenous, and Inuit communities. Your thoughts?
Well, no, we are planning from a supply chain community to deploy at scale throughout Canada, and not only in urban centers. And so that would include, remote locations, the Indigenous communities, First Nations as well. So that's how we're thinking about it from a supply chain and from a deployment perspective. Again, those are decisions that public health, I'm sure, will be instructing us in the weeks and months ahead.
You touched on this early in the conversation. How does it differ? How do you think the COVID vaccine distribution will differ from the annual flu vaccine?
It's with the many unknowns at this point. There are some pieces that we do know. The vaccine will, in all likelihood, come from outside of Canada, so we need to secure the supply. We need to bring it in to the country. So the inbound transportation, if you think about this, the manufacturers of the vaccines will be manufacturing for the global market and will in all likelihood, want to move fairly quickly. So this will require, I suspect, air cargo more than maritime transportation in order to accelerate the access to these vaccines. And as you think about the scale, we're talking about globally potentially over 10 billion vaccines. And that would require tens of thousands of flights to move vaccines just to position it in the various countries. And so think about the inbound requirements, the capacity for cold chain, frozen, ultra frozen storage at the airport level, onboard aircrafts, and then trying to figure out, okay, once it lands in Canada, so it needs to clear customs, and we don't know whether the manufacturers will be using a direct shipment method where they may be shipping directly to the points of administration, which would be quite burdensome, if you want, in terms of clearing customs with multiple shipments, multiple smaller shipments, or will they think about this in terms of cross-docking bulk shipments in Canada, or using warehousing facilities so that distributors will then break down the packaging from bulk to smaller sizes to get to the points of administration. Those are unknown at this point, but as you think about those scenarios, at every point in time, you need capacity to handle it in frozen, ultra frozen, or refrigerated state.
Well, do you think Canada has the capacity? Storage capacity?
Ambient and refrigerated are less of a concern. Frozen has some capacity. I don't know that we've got capacity to do 75 million doses at scale in a short period of time. And we certainly do not have currently ultra frozen capacity. So to the best of our knowledge, about a third of the vaccines that are deemed to be available within the next year or so require ultra frozen capacity. And so if you think about in Canada, 75 million vaccines to do double dosing of everybody in Canada, if a third needs to be ultra frozen, I can assure you that there is insufficient infrastructure and capacity today to do 25 million doses of ultra frozen vaccines. So that's something that we need to think about. There may be some creative solutions in terms of accessing people who have ultra frozen capacity, but not necessarily for vaccines. And you can think about the food industry or other industries that are using frozen storage capacity, and whether or not Health Canada would, on a temporary and interim basis, use such infrastructure and capacities to help with the deployment of vaccines. I'm thinking out loud here. This is not something that we've strategized around, but I think this will require some, as we mentioned previously, intense collaboration and some pretty innovative ideas.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. What about packaging? I mean, can we produce enough potentially dry ice? Do we have access to sufficient, passive shippers? That's a lot of, I imagine it's going to be a lot of distribution. Do we have enough trucks?
Well, truck storage capacity, packaging, dry ice, vials. And these vaccines need to be in vials. Syringes, needles, the raw material to make the vaccines. So those are all important questions that are part of the overarching supply chain to manufacture vaccines and to distribute and deploy vaccines. And I'll give you, a bit of an insight. I'm led to believe that vials themselves may be in short supply in terms of doing this at scale, and manufacturers are thinking about putting multiple doses in a single vial, as opposed to a single dose per vial. There's not enough vials to go around, so you would need larger vials that would contain multiple doses. And you say, well, okay, so from a manufacturing perspective, that's probably the easiest way to do it. But then you think through the implications of having multiple doses in a vial down the supply chain at the point of administration. So if you need to scale down, go from ultra-frozen to a refrigerated state in order to administer the vaccines, but you're actually opening up an ultra-frozen package, which has maybe 5, 6, 10, 12 doses in a vial. With that vial, then what is the stability? What's the shelf life? And in some cases, we're only talking days. And so you need to line up your immunization so that you can actually use the doses effectively without wasting product. And so again, you need to think through all the various steps in the supply chain. And that's why this makes it such a complex and difficult exercise.
Let's talk about points of administration. Where should the vaccine best be delivered? Doctors' offices, pharmacies, hospitals, local health authorities, schools. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, to do it at scale, the answer is likely all of the above. I do not foresee public health infrastructure and resources being able to do this at scale quickly. And so I think we'll need to leverage other parts of clinicians, whether they're doctors, pharmacies, and various venues. And you mentioned schools as well. So we need to think through how to do this at scale and how to deliver the vaccines at these points of administration. But we are thinking about this from a supply chain perspective, as doing it at scale will require multiple points, hundreds and thousands of points of distribution, and gearing up the distribution infrastructure to do so accordingly.
Hey, Dan, thanks. Are there any final thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Well, there are many unknowns, and this is a first on a worldwide basis. It's not necessarily that we're going to learn from other jurisdictions ahead of us, because we'll want to be deploying COVID-19 vaccines at the same time as anybody else who has access to vaccines. So given the many unknowns, given the complexity, I think we can only reiterate that this will require a very high level of collaboration to execute well the deployment of COVID-19 vaccines throughout Canada. And because my spidey sense tells me that we do not have sufficient capacity, particularly on the ultra-frozen and frozen side of this deployment, that time is of the essence. Even though the vaccines are not available yet, we need to start being planful between the public sector, the private sector, all the various supply chain actors need to be engaged in conversations. And I would hope that the COVID-19 Vaccine Task Force will be, in short order, reaching out to these various stakeholders very shortly, because as I mentioned, time is of the essence in order to be ready for potentially as early as Q1 and Q2 of 2021.
Dan, thank you once again. Thank you for your time and thank you for your leadership during this difficult time. If the audience would like to connect with you, how can they contact you?
So you can reach out to the Canadian Association for Pharmacy Distribution Management. Our website is CAPDM.ca. And alternatively, you can also reach out to me directly through my email at daniel@capdm.ca.
Awesome. Contact details for Dan are also available on our website at pharmapodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. This podcast, along with a transcript of the show, can be found on our website at www.thepharmapodcast.ca. The Pharma Podcast is also available to listen for free on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast. Thank you to our sound engineer, Errol Francis, and the town of Oakville. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast, or if there's a topic we should cover in future episodes, please connect with me via LinkedIn.